My name is Hazel. I am 24 years old and I work 3 different jobs just to keep the heating on in our decaying house. On the 15th birthday of my younger brother, I found a thick stack of hidden envelopes stuffed behind a loose brick in the basement. My father was supposed to be at a support meeting that specific night. He absolutely did not go to the meeting. The teenage boy was upstairs blowing out cheap candles, while I was standing in the cold dark holding the absolute ruin of his financial future. My hands trembled violently before I even opened the final envelope. The name printed on the final collection notice was absolutely not my father. It was the exact legal name of my younger brother. I did not shed a single tear in that damp basement. I walked straight upstairs and started packing a heavy canvas bag. What I discovered about the man who was supposed to protect us is something I will never, ever forgive. By the very next morning, he was completely gone, and the real nightmare officially began. Welcome back to Drama Storytime, where we sit quietly with the deep family betrayals that people never talk about out loud. Please drop a comment and be sure to subscribe to the channel. I should probably explain exactly who I am and the massive weight I carry on my shoulders before I tell you what the man did to us. I am the oldest of 4 siblings, living in a rusted industrial town on the edge of the state. I work the early shift at a local diner and the late shift at a commercial laundry facility. I also clean residential houses on the weekends. I sleep exactly 4 hours every single night. I do all of this because my mother walked out the front door when I was 15 years old, and she never looked back. She left me entirely alone with 3 terrified children and a man who loved cheap whiskey much more than he loved his own family. The town we live in is the kind of place where everyone knows your terrible business, but nobody ever steps in to actually help you. They just watch you struggle from their comfortable front porches. I learned very early in life that childhood is an expensive luxury we simply could not afford. The young boy named Leo is currently 15 years old, and he is a brilliant student who builds complex radios out of spare parts. The middle sister is 19, and she works at a local grocery store to help me buy food. The youngest sister is only 9 years old, and she still believes our father is a good man who just has a mysterious sickness. I spent my entire youth building on a massive fortress of strict routines and tight budgets just to keep the 4 of us alive and perfectly together. I paid the utility bills in cash. I bought winter coats from the thrift store. I cooked large pots of cheap soup that would last for an entire week. I truly thought my endless sacrifice was keeping the wolves away from our front door. I thought I was successfully holding the broken pieces of our family together. It took a hidden stack of red envelopes to teach me that the worst wolf was already living safely inside our house. The evening of the birthday party started the exact same way every single celebration in our house always started. It began with me counting crumpled dollar bills on the kitchen table to see if I could afford a small cake. I had been awake since 4:00 in the morning. I managed to buy a modest chocolate cake from the discount bakery shelf. I decorated the small living room with handmade paper signs. My siblings were genuinely happy. We had a strict rule in the house that we never talked about our father when he was out drinking. We just pretended we were a perfectly normal family for one single evening. The addict had promised me he would attend his recovery group that night. He swore on the life of my youngest sister that he would stay completely sober for the birthday celebration. Right around 8 in the evening, the plumbing in the old kitchen sink completely failed. Dirty water started flooding across the worn linoleum floor. I grabbed a heavy metal wrench and ran down into the dark basement to shut off the main water valve. The basement always smelled like wet dirt and old regret. I reached behind the rusted pipes to turn the heavy metal wheel. My hand accidentally knocked a loose brick out of the old foundation wall. A large stack of thick envelopes tumbled out of the dark hole and landed directly on the damp concrete floor. The envelopes were marked with urgent red stamps from major credit card companies and aggressive collection agencies. I knelt down and picked up the damp papers. I thought they were just another massive pile of debts belonging to my father. I thought I was already completely numb to his endless financial destruction. I tore open the first thick envelope with my dirty hands. The printed document was a final warning for a severely delinquent credit card account. The outstanding balance was exactly $8,500. I looked closely at the billing name located at the top of the white page. The name printed on the legal debt was absolutely not the name of the addict. The name was Leo. The fraudulent account had been secretly opened exactly 3 years ago when the young boy was only 12 years old. My father had actively stolen the Social Security number of his own young son to fund his terrible addiction. I sat perfectly still on the damp concrete floor and opened the next envelope. The second letter was a default notice for a massive personal loan. The total amount owed was exactly $12,000. The name printed on that specific document was my 19-year-old sister. I ripped open a third envelope with my bare hands. It was an unpaid medical bill from a private rehabilitation clinic. The clinic address was located 2 towns over. My father had secretly checked himself into a luxury clinic exactly 2 years ago. While we were eating expired canned soup for dinner, he used the stolen identity of my young sister to pay for his comfortable stay. The total sum of the hidden debt stuffed inside that single cinder block was staggering. I counted exactly $42,000 in fraudulent credit cards and defaulted loans. The addict had completely destroyed the financial futures of his own children before they even had a chance to grow up. The absolute sheer scale of the betrayal made my lungs burn. I realized my entire life of endless sacrifice was just a convenient shield, protecting the terrible monster. I carefully gathered every single piece of damp paper and shoved them deep into the pockets of my heavy work jacket. I stood up and wiped the dirty water from my knees. I turned the heavy metal valve to shut off the broken plumbing. Then I walked slowly up the wooden stairs toward the warm light of the kitchen. The young teenage boy was cutting his small chocolate cake into 4 equal slices. He looked up and smiled at me with pure, innocent joy. The middle sister was pouring cheap fruit juice into mismatched plastic cups. The youngest girl was singing a happy song while wearing a homemade paper crown. I stood in the doorway and forced my face into a bright smile. I absolutely did not want to ruin his one special night. I ate my small slice of chocolate cake and listened to my siblings talk about their future dreams. The brilliant boy talked about going to a prestigious engineering college. He had absolutely no idea his credit score was already completely destroyed. I simply nodded my head and promised him he would definitely go to college. The birthday party ended right around 10 in the evening. I tucked the youngest girl into her warm bed. I made sure the older siblings were safely asleep in their shared room. I sat alone in the dark living room and waited for the heavy front door to open. The addict finally stumbled inside the house at exactly 2 in the morning. He smelled strongly of cheap alcohol and stale cigarette smoke. He tripped over a pair of old shoes and cursed softly in the dark hallway. I turned on a single small lamp sitting on the corner table. He flinched at the sudden bright light and tried to put on his usual pathetic smile. He told me the support meeting ran very late, and he simply lost track of the time. I stood up from the worn sofa and walked directly toward him. I reached into the deep pockets of my work jacket and pulled out the thick stack of red envelopes. I dropped the fraudulent documents onto the wooden floor right at his feet. The fake smile completely vanished from his tired face. He looked down at the scattered papers and then looked back up at me. He started to stammer and make terrible excuses. He whispered that he was planning to pay every single dollar back as soon as he found a good job. I kept my voice incredibly low so I would not wake the sleeping children. I told him he stole the identity of a 12-year-old boy to buy cheap whiskey. He took a step backward and leaned heavily against the front door. He tried to tell me I did not understand the heavy pressure he was under. He claimed he only did it to keep the family floating during the hard times. I calmly told him he was a completely worthless liar. I stated that the luxury rehabilitation clinic was absolutely not a family necessity. He realized I had read every single piece of paper. He started to cry those fake tears he always used to manipulate my deep sympathy. Those were the exact tears that usually made me work extra shifts to help him out. This specific time, the fake tears did absolutely nothing to my cold heart. The addict realized his fake tears were completely failing to manipulate my emotions. He suddenly shifted his entire strategy. The pathetic crying instantly stopped, and his face hardened into something deeply ugly and cold. He stood up straight and tried to use his physical size to intimidate me in the small hallway. He stepped aggressively toward me and whispered that I was being completely ungrateful. He claimed he put a roof over my head for 24 years. I stood my ground and did not move a single inch. I told him the roof was currently leaking, and I was the only person paying the property taxes. I reminded him that my minimum wage jobs were the only reason we had electricity. The older man scoffed and told me I was just a dramatic little girl who did not understand how the real world actually operated. I calmly replied that I understood financial fraud perfectly well. I pointed my finger toward the heavy wooden door. I told him he had exactly 10 minutes to pack a single bag and leave the house forever. He laughed a dark and bitter laugh. He confidently stated that I needed him too much. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes and told him he was nothing but a massive anchor drowning my entire family. I stated that if he was not completely gone by sunrise, I would walk straight into the local police station. I promised him I would hand over every single piece of fraudulent paper to the fraud detectives. I told him identity theft of a minor carries a very strict prison sentence. The arrogant smirk completely melted off his face. He finally realized I was absolutely not bluffing. He knew I had spent my entire life being the responsible adult, and he knew I would follow through on my threat. The broken man turned around and walked down the hallway toward his messy bedroom. I stood perfectly still in the living room and listened to him throw his cheap clothes into a canvas bag. He was violently slamming wooden drawers and muttering terrible curses under his breath. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or regret. I only felt a cold and empty silence taking root inside my chest. He walked back into the living room carrying his heavy bag. He stopped near the front door and told me I was going to fail completely without his guidance. He promised me the harsh world would chew me up and spit me out. I did not offer him a single word in response. I simply stepped aside and opened the front door for him. He walked out into the dark night, and I shut the heavy door behind him. I turned the metal deadbolt and securely locked the toxic monster out of our fragile lives. The morning sun rose slowly over the rusted industrial town. I was still sitting awake at the wooden kitchen table. I'd spent the remaining 4 hours of the night organizing the terrible stack of fraudulent debts. I separated the defaulted loans into specific piles based on which innocent sibling was targeted. The young boy had exactly $18,000 in credit card debt. The middle sister had $24,000 in massive personal loans. I drank 3 cups of black coffee to keep my exhausted body functioning. The sound of small footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs. The youngest sister walked into the kitchen, rubbing her sleepy eyes. She asked me where our father was this morning. I pulled her into my lap and kissed her forehead. I told her he had to go far away to finally get the medical help he desperately needed. The young girl simply nodded her head. The brilliant teenage boy walked into the kitchen a few minutes later. He noticed the massive stack of red envelopes spread across the table. He immediately recognized the aggressive logos of the collection agencies. He looked at my tired face and asked me what was wrong. I knew I could not lie to him the same way I lied to the youngest girl. I asked him to sit down across from me. I told him our father had done something absolutely terrible and illegal. I explained that we were going to face a massive storm, but I promised him I would shield him from the worst parts. The young boy listened quietly as I explained the stolen identity and the ruined credit score. He did not cry or yell. He just stared at the wooden table with a blank expression. I reached across the table and held his cold hand. I told him we were going to fight this deep injustice perfectly together. The 19-year-old sister returned from her early grocery store shift a few hours later. She walked into the kitchen wearing her green uniform and carrying a bag of cheap bread. She immediately noticed the tense atmosphere and the stack of red envelopes sitting on the table. The young boy was staring blankly at the wall while I was writing a detailed list on a yellow notepad. I asked my sister to sit down and listen to me very carefully. I told her the exact same terrible truth I had just told our brother. I watched the color completely drain from her tired face. She looked at the defaulted loan documents bearing her legal name and started to shake uncontrollably. I explained to my sister that our father took out exactly $24,000 in her name. She asked how he managed to forge her signature on the legal documents. I told her he simply memorized her social security number and used a fake digital signature online. The absolute ease of his crime made it even more disgusting. She asked me where he was right now. I told her he was permanently exiled from our lives, and she would never have to see his face again unless it was inside a courtroom. She whispered that she was planning to apply for a small student loan next month to attend the community college. I had to tell her that her credit was entirely ruined and the bank would instantly reject her application. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed quietly into her palms. I stood up and wrapped my arms tightly around her shaking shoulders. I promised her I would fix this massive disaster, even if it took me the rest of my life. We spent the entire Sunday afternoon gathering every single piece of required evidence. I organized the fraudulent credit card bills and the fake medical invoices into separate manila folders. I printed out the official credit reports for both of my siblings using my laptop computer. The next morning, I walked directly into the local police station located in the center of our rusted town. The station smelled like stale coffee and old floor wax. A tired police officer was sitting behind thick security glass reading a sports magazine. I slid the heavy folders under the narrow gap in the glass and told him I needed to file a formal report for severe identity theft. The older officer sighed heavily and looked at the massive stack of papers. He asked me if I knew who committed the financial fraud. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him my own father was the criminal. The officer stopped chewing his gum and stared at me with a look of deep pity. He told me that reporting my own father would likely send the man to a state prison. I absolutely did not blink or look away from his face. I calmly stated that my father had already built a permanent prison for his own children, and I was simply handing him the keys to his own cell. The police officer slowly typed up the formal criminal complaint. I signed the legal documents with a steady hand and requested official copies for the national credit bureaus. Leaving the police station felt like dropping a massive boulder from my tired shoulders. I walked straight to my afternoon shift at the commercial laundry facility. The giant washing machines were incredibly loud, and the air was thick with hot steam. I spent 8 straight hours folding heavy white sheets and breathing the harsh chemical bleach. During my short break, I used my mobile phone to call the major credit bureaus. I placed a permanent security freeze on the social security numbers of all 3 of my siblings. I finally reached a human representative and explained the fraudulent situation. The representative told me I needed to mail the official police reports to their fraud department. The sheer amount of administrative work required to undo a massive crime is incredibly overwhelming. You have to prove you are innocent while the giant financial corporations automatically assume you are guilty. I finished my long shift and walked home through the dark streets of our industrial town. The cold wind bit through my thin jacket, but the internal fire burning inside my chest kept me completely warm. I was building a brand new fortress for my family, and this specific fortress would have absolutely no hidden cracks in the foundation. The very next morning, the aggressive collection agencies started calling our home telephone. The phone rang constantly from dawn to dusk. I answered every single call with a calm and flat voice. The operators tried to intimidate me with heavy threats of immediate legal action. They demanded to speak with a 15-year-old boy regarding his massive overdue credit card balance. I informed each angry operator that the young boy was currently sitting in a high school math class. I calmly read the official police report number to every single collection agency that called our house. Some of the operators called me a liar and threatened to seize our personal property. I told them to mail their empty threats directly to the local police fraud division. I hung up the phone and crossed their specific corporate names off my yellow notepad. The endless administrative battle was mentally exhausting, but I refused to let them terrorize my family. The toxic addict realized he could not manipulate me. He targeted the softer heart of my 19-year-old sister instead. He called the local grocery store where she worked on a Tuesday afternoon. The young girl was scanning cheap vegetables when the manager handed her the telephone. The desperate man cried pathetic tears and begged her to withdraw the police report. He falsely claimed he was living on the cold streets and coughing up dark blood. He promised her he would completely change his life if she gave him one final chance. The sweet girl started to cry right in the middle of the crowded store. She told him she loved him, but she could not undo the legal process. He suddenly turned incredibly vicious. He screamed terrible insults at his own daughter and blamed her for destroying his life. The cruel monster completely exposed his true nature to the very child he had deeply robbed. My sister walked home from her shift with swollen red eyes. She sat at the wooden kitchen table and told me exactly what the angry man had said. I felt a boiling rage expanding inside my tired chest. I made her a warm cup of herbal tea and held her trembling hands. I firmly told her that his tragic situation was entirely his own fault. I promised her that the cruel insults he screamed were just the desperate lies of a cornered animal. The brilliant teenage boy walked into the kitchen and saw his older sister crying. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder and told her we are much better off without the toxic man in our lives. We sat together in the warm kitchen and slowly rebuilt the protective walls around our fragile family. I knew I could not fight the massive financial corporations entirely by myself. I took a morning off from the local diner and rode the public bus to a free legal aid clinic downtown. I sat in the crowded waiting room for 3 long hours before a tired legal volunteer finally called my name. I sat across from his metal desk and handed him my thick manila folder. I explained the stolen identities and the fraudulent credit accounts. I told him I had already filed a formal police report and placed a permanent freeze on their social security numbers. The young lawyer looked at the massive sum of $42,000 and slowly shook his head in absolute disbelief. The legal volunteer told me my proactive steps saved my siblings from complete financial ruin. He explained that fighting the large banks would be a very long and brutal war of attrition. The giant corporations would demand endless documentation and sworn affidavits to prove the minor children did not authorize Eva's the massive debts. The young lawyer promised to help me draft the formal dispute letters and navigate the complex legal maze. He warned me that the banks would likely try to pressure me into paying a small portion of the fraudulent debt to make the problem go away. I told him I would absolutely never pay a single cent of that stolen money. I stated I would rather fight them in a cold courtroom for the rest of my natural life The young attorney smiled and handed me a stack of blank legal forms so we could immediately go to work. The young lawyer from the free clinic helped me fill out the massive stack of sworn affidavits. I spent the next 3 weeks mailing thick envelopes to every single credit card company and aggressive debt collector. The giant banks absolutely did not want to lose their stolen money. Several corporate fraud departments sent me rejection letters claiming the teenage boy must have benefited from the illegal purchases. I wrote a very cold letter back to their corporate offices. I stated that a 12-year-old boy absolutely did not authorize stays at luxury rehabilitation clinics or purchase vast quantities of cheap alcohol. I enclosed the official police report and the identity theft affidavits once again. The young lawyer called the corporate attorneys directly. He calmly threatened to take the giant banks to federal court for completely violating basic consumer protection laws. The relentless legal pressure finally started to crack their solid corporate walls. One by one, the giant financial institutions began wiping the fraudulent debts from the official credit reports of my young siblings. It was a very slow and exhausting war of attrition, but we were finally winning the legal battles. We were slowly starting to breathe a little bit easier inside our old rusted house. The 19-year-old sister was finally able to submit her application for a small student loan. The brilliant teenage boy went back to building his complex radios without the heavy weight of financial ruin hanging over his bright future. Then, the terrible ghost from our dark past suddenly decided to reappear and shatter our fragile peace. The heavy telephone sitting on the kitchen counter rang on a rainy Thursday evening. I picked up the plastic receiver and heard a very familiar voice that made my blood run completely cold. The absent woman who gave birth to us was speaking on the other end of the static line. She had abandoned our struggling family exactly 9 years ago without leaving a single forwarding address. She claimed she recently heard through mutual friends that I finally kicked the toxic addict out of the house. She spoke with a very soft and highly rehearsed voice. She told me she was currently living just 3 towns away and she desperately wanted to come home to help me raise the innocent children. My grip on the plastic telephone receiver became incredibly tight. I did not say a single word for a very long time. The absent woman nervously filled the heavy silence by claiming she had completely changed her selfish ways. She promised me she was finally ready to be a real supportive mother to the young siblings she casually threw away. I took a very deep breath and kept my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. I told the absent woman she completely lost the right to call herself a mother almost a decade ago. She started to cry those exact same fake tears the toxic addict always used to manipulate my deep sympathy. She begged me to just let her see the youngest girl and the brilliant teenage boy for one single afternoon. I calmly reminded her that the youngest girl was only a tiny baby when she walked out the front door and never looked back. I told her the young boy had to teach himself how to navigate the harsh world because she left him completely alone with a dangerous monster. The absent woman defensively claimed she had to leave the toxic marriage to protect her own mental health. I told her a real mother would have taken her innocent children with her when she decided to flee the burning house. I stated that she simply chose her own absolute freedom over our basic survival. She realized her pathetic excuses were completely failing to penetrate my cold armor. She angrily accused me of selfishly keeping the children away from their true biological family. I told her we already built a real family and she is absolutely not a part of it. I firmly stated that she is nothing but a total stranger to the siblings I raised with my own bleeding hands. I hung up the heavy telephone and immediately contacted the phone company to permanently block her specific number. I walked into the warm living room and saw my 3 siblings sitting together on the worn sofa. The teenage boy was helping the youngest girl with her school homework. The middle sister was reading a thick textbook for her upcoming college classes. They looked perfectly safe and completely oblivious to the dark storm I had just quietly defeated in the kitchen. I realized that my strict boundaries were the only things keeping the toxic predators away from our peaceful sanctuary. I absolutely refused to let the absent woman return and destroy the beautiful life we were actively building from the ashes. The peaceful sanctuary we built inside our rusted house remained undisturbed for exactly 2 quiet months. I continued working my early shifts at the local diner and washing sheets at the laundry facility. The middle sister enrolled in her first college classes. The brilliant boy focused on his complex science projects. I believed the absolute worst parts of our nightmare were permanently behind us. I was completely wrong. The final act of our tragedy began on a cold Tuesday morning. I was scrubbing the floor when a dark blue sedan pulled into our driveway. 2 serious men wearing neat gray suits stepped out of the vehicle. They looked exactly like formal authority figures. I opened the heavy door before they could knock. The taller man held up a silver badge and introduced himself as a state fraud detective. I led the 2 detectives into the living room and asked them to sit on the worn sofa. The detective opened a thick folder and pulled out familiar legal documents. He calmly informed me that the toxic man who destroyed our lives was currently sitting in a county jail cell 3 towns away. The desperate addict had tried to purchase a used vehicle using a completely stolen identity. He was totally unaware that the local police had already flagged the stolen social security numbers in the national database. The dealership immediately called the authorities when the credit check triggered a massive fraud alert. The police officers arrested him right on the showroom floor. The state detective looked directly into my eyes and asked me a very difficult question. He wanted to confirm that I was prepared to testify against the toxic man in a formal court. The older detective warned me that criminal trials involving close family members are incredibly brutal. He explained that the defense attorney would try to paint me as a vindictive daughter. They would claim I was confusing the innocent mistakes with malicious fraud. I sat perfectly still and listened to every word he said. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation. I told the detective that the toxic man actively chose to sacrifice his own innocent children to feed his terrible addiction. I firmly stated that I would gladly sit in a cold witness box for 100 days if it meant keeping my siblings safe. The detectives nodded their heads in quiet respect. They handed me a formal subpoena and told me the preliminary hearing was scheduled for December. They walked out of the house and drove away. I closed the front door and leaned against the cold wood. The sudden reality of sending the father of my siblings to a state prison finally hit my exhausted body. I knew I was doing the right thing, but it still felt incredibly heavy. I walked back into the kitchen and poured a cup of black coffee. I needed to figure out how to tell the young siblings that they might have to face him in a crowded courtroom. The brilliant teenage boy came home from his high school classes a few hours later. I asked him to sit down at the kitchen table because we needed to have a serious conversation. I looked at his bright young face and told him about the sudden arrest. I explained the upcoming criminal trial and the possibility that he might have to answer difficult questions in front of a stern judge. The young boy stared blankly at the wooden table. He was silent for a very long time. He finally looked up at me with an expression that was far too old for a 15-year-old child. He told me he was absolutely not afraid of the toxic man anymore. He reached across the table and grabbed my tired hand. He promised me he would tell the absolute truth to the judge and the quiet jury. He said he wanted to make sure the toxic man could never steal the future from another innocent person ever again. I felt a sudden wave of immense pride wash over my tired soul. I realized I had successfully raised a young man who was incredibly brave. We sat together in the quiet kitchen and prepared our minds for the upcoming legal war. We were absolutely ready to face the dark storm. The cold month of December finally arrived and brought a bitter winter chill to our rusted, industrial town. The morning of the preliminary hearing was incredibly dark and covered in heavy gray clouds. I dressed in a simple black suit I had purchased from the local thrift store. The brilliant teenage boy wore a crisp white shirt and a dark blue tie. The middle sister stayed home to watch the youngest girl because we absolutely refused to let the tiny child step foot inside a criminal courthouse. We drove to the state courthouse in total silence. We walked through the heavy glass doors and passed through the strict metal security detectors. The state detective was waiting for us in the long marble hallway. He offered a warm cup of coffee and told us to remain completely calm, no matter what the defense attorney decided to say. We entered the grand courtroom and sat on the hard wooden benches. The massive room smelled perfectly clean, but felt incredibly cold. A heavy wooden door opened near the front of the room. The toxic man was led into the courtroom wearing a bright orange prison uniform. His hands were securely bound with heavy metal chains. He looked much older and significantly weaker than the last time I saw him standing in our hallway. He refused to look directly at his own children. He just stared at the polished wooden floor. A tall man wearing an expensive gray suit walked in and sat right next to him. That specific man was the aggressive defense attorney the state had provided for the criminal. The stern judge entered the room and everyone stood up in absolute silence. The state prosecutor began the legal proceedings by reading the massive list of formal charges. The prosecutor detailed the stolen identities and the $42,000 in fraudulent debts. The defense attorney immediately stood up and began spinning a completely ridiculous narrative. The tall lawyer claimed his client was just a desperate father trying to keep his impoverished family alive. The slick attorney painted a fake picture of a man buying groceries and paying heating bills with the stolen credit cards. He loudly suggested that I was simply a vindictive daughter who wanted to punish a struggling man for his past parenting mistakes. He tried to make the toxic man look like a tragic martyr instead of a selfish monster. I sat perfectly still on the wooden bench and felt my heart beating slowly and steadily. I knew his cheap lies would completely fall apart the exact second I took the witness stand. The state prosecutor called my name and asked me to walk to the front of the quiet room. I swore an official oath to tell the absolute truth. The prosecutor asked me to explain exactly how I found the hidden red envelopes inside the dark basement. I kept my voice incredibly calm and flat. I detailed the broken plumbing and the loose cinder block. Then the aggressive defense attorney walked toward the witness box to begin his cross-examination. He tried to use his booming voice to intimidate me in front of the stern judge. The slick lawyer asked me if it was true that I deeply hated my father. I looked directly into his eyes and told him I simply hated the massive financial destruction my father deliberately caused. The attorney loudly asked if the borrowed money was used to buy food for the young siblings. I calmly corrected him and stated that the stolen money was explicitly used to buy cheap alcohol and fund a comfortable stay at a luxury rehabilitation clinic. I explained that a 12-year-old boy absolutely does not need to check himself into a private adult rehabilitation center located 2 towns away. I told the judge I had the exact receipts for every single fraudulent transaction. The entire courtroom went completely silent. The stern judge looked down at the formal financial documents and then glared directly at the toxic man. The defense attorney tried to quickly change the subject, but his fake narrative was completely destroyed. I stepped down from the wooden witness box, feeling completely drained, but victorious. The toxic man kept his head bowed in total, absolute shame. The state prosecutor then called the brilliant teenage boy to the witness stand. My young brother stood up from the hard wooden bench and buttoned his suit jacket. He looked incredibly small, but emitted a massive aura of pure courage. I watched him walk down the center aisle of the quiet courtroom to formally face the monster who had maliciously stolen his legal identity. The brilliant teenage boy sat down in the wooden witness box. He looked directly at the stern judge and swore to tell the absolute truth. The state prosecutor approached the wooden stand and spoke with a very gentle voice. The prosecutor asked the young boy to state his exact age for the official court record. The brave teenager clearly stated he was exactly 15 years old. The lawyer then handed him a thick stack of printed credit card applications. The prosecutor asked the boy to look closely at the signature located at the bottom of the formal documents. The young boy examined the printed pages and firmly stated that the messy handwriting did absolutely not belong to him. He explained that he was only 12 years old when those specific accounts were opened, and he did not even know what a credit score was at that young age. The state prosecutor returned to his wooden table. The aggressive defense attorney stood up and walked slowly toward the witness box. The tall lawyer tried a completely different tactic this time. He softened his loud voice and tried to act like a concerned uncle. The attorney asked the young boy if he remembered receiving a new bicycle for his 13th birthday. The lawyer suggested that the toxic man used the borrowed money to buy nice gifts for his beloved children. The brilliant boy did not flinch or look away. He looked directly at the slick attorney and stated that his older sister bought that cheap bicycle from a local thrift store. He calmly explained that the older sister worked a double shift at the diner just to afford the rusty bicycle. The young boy then pointed his finger directly at the toxic man sitting in the orange uniform. He told the silent courtroom that his biological father was completely absent on that specific birthday because he was busy spending stolen money at a private resort. The aggressive attorney tried to interrupt the young boy, but the stern judge immediately raised a hand to stop the lawyer. The judge instructed the brave teenager to finish his complete sentence. The young boy took a deep breath and spoke with incredible clarity. He told the judge that our fragile family survived entirely on expired canned soup and cheap bread, while the toxic man destroyed our legal identities. The undeniable truth hanging in the cold air was simply too much for the desperate addict to handle. The toxic man suddenly jumped up from his wooden chair and started screaming terrible insults at his own young son. He violently rattled his heavy metal chains and called the brilliant boy a completely ungrateful liar. The entire courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. 2 armed security guards rushed forward and forced the angry monster back into his wooden seat. The stern judge banged a heavy wooden gavel and demanded immediate silence in the grand courtroom. The true nature of the toxic man had been completely exposed for everyone to clearly see. The cheap facade of a struggling father was permanently shattered by his own violent outburst. The defense attorney slowly sat down and rubbed his tired face in total defeat. He knew he had absolutely no case left to argue. The stern judge looked down at the angry man with deep disgust. The judge announced a short recess to review the formal evidence before issuing a final legal ruling. We walked out of the cold courtroom and stood in the long marble hallway. The state detective bought us warm, hot chocolate from a small vending machine. I stood near the large window and watched the gray winter clouds rolling for our rusted industrial town. The brilliant teenage boy stood right next to me and drank his warm beverage. I told him he was the absolute bravest person I had ever met in my entire life. He smiled softly and said he learned how to be incredibly brave by watching me fight for our family every single day. The heavy weight that had crushed my tired shoulders for 9 long years suddenly felt incredibly light. We were just a few minutes away from total freedom. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom finally opened again. A uniformed guard called our names and told us the stern judge was ready to deliver the final verdict. We walked back into the grand room, holding our heads incredibly high. We were completely ready to watch the heavy doors of a state prison permanently close on our dark past. The stern judge sat quietly behind the tall wooden bench. He looked down at the toxic man and delivered a severe legal lecture. He stated that stealing the legal identity of a young child is a completely despicable financial crime. He noted that committing this massive fraud against your own biological children makes the terrible action absolutely unforgivable. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel onto the sounding block. He formally sentenced the toxic man to exactly 7 years in a state penitentiary. He explicitly ordered that there would be absolutely no possibility of early parole. The armed security guards immediately grabbed the heavy metal chains. They forcefully dragged the screaming monster out of the quiet courtroom. He yelled terrible curses at our family, but his angry voice slowly faded down the long marble hallway. That exact moment was the absolute last time I ever saw his ugly face or heard his toxic voice. We walked out of the grand courthouse and stepped directly into the cold winter air. The dark gray clouds had finally broken apart. A bright ray of afternoon sunlight was shining directly onto the wide concrete steps. The state fraud detective shook my hand and thanked me for my incredible bravery. The brilliant teenage boy looked up at the bright winter sky and smiled, a completely genuine smile. I wrapped my heavy work jacket tightly around my cold shoulders and felt a deep sense of total peace. The massive legal war was officially over. We had successfully defended our fragile family against the worst kind of domestic predator. We walked to the bus stop and rode back to our rusted industrial town with our heads held incredibly high. Exactly 6 months passed after that dramatic criminal trial. The young lawyer from the free legal clinic called my phone on a warm Tuesday afternoon. He happily informed me that the major credit bureaus had finally processed all the formal paperwork. They completely cleared the massive fraudulent debts from the national system. The official credit reports for my young siblings were entirely pristine. The massive burden of $42,000 was officially erased from our permanent records. The 19-year-old sister successfully secured her small student loan. She immediately started attending her community college classes. She is currently studying incredibly hard to become a pediatric nurse. The brilliant teenage boy recently won a regional science fair. He built a highly complex radio system using discarded electronic parts. He is actively applying for prestigious engineering scholarships. The youngest girl is exactly 10 years old now, and she is incredibly happy. She completely forgot the toxic man and only knows a warm house filled with deep love and strict safety. We celebrated her special birthday with a massive chocolate cake and absolutely no hidden secrets. I am exactly 25 years old now. I officially quit my exhausting night shift at the commercial laundry facility. I finally have enough free time to sleep a full 8 hours every single night. I still work my regular shifts at the local diner, but I am actively saving money to open my own small bakery one day. The loose cinder block in the dark basement is completely sealed with fresh gray cement. The heavy anxiety that used to live constantly inside my tired chest has been entirely replaced by a quiet confidence. Being the oldest sibling in a broken home forces you to grow up far too fast. You have to build massive defensive walls and sacrifice your own youth to keep the innocent children safe from the dark storms. I used to think my endless sacrifices were just a tragic burden. But looking at my beautiful siblings thriving in the warm sunlight, I finally realized my fierce protection was actually my greatest superpower. That is my complete story. A broken water pipe and a hidden stack of red envelopes. A massive financial betrayal finally answered by pure legal justice. Thank you for listening to Calm Drama Stories. If you have ever had to fight a toxic family member to protect your peace, please share this video with someone who truly needs to hear it. Set your strict boundaries and absolutely never let anyone steal your bright future. Leave a comment below if you made it to the very end, and make sure you hit the subscribe button. I will see you in the next story.